Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives, episode 148. I am so excited that you guys are going to meet Peter Pomerantsev. He is the author of multiple Bibles of Mine and Understanding Narrative Warfare. He wrote Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and this is not propaganda. He's currently working on a new project, and he's going to talk about how we need to do a better job at framing how we view information warfare and how, unfortunately, in America, we did this to ourselves, but we can get out of it. Have a listen. Peter Pomerantsev, so grateful that you're taking the time to be with us here today. As I was explaining to High Fidelity before the interview, you've written a number of books that have been so key to my understanding of what's happening in the time that we're living in and how truth is becoming an endangered species. And I would love for you to sort of recap a little bit about your unique background, your parents, where you grew up, and how you sort of identified and warned the West that this disinformation world was coming, and here we are. So I'm looking forward to jumping in. But first, I'd love for you to introduce yourself a bit to our audience.
Sure, my name is Peter Pomerantsev. I work at Johns Hopkins University now. I sort of teach courses about propaganda and how we should fight it or do it better. I've written three books now about contemporary and historical propaganda, really focused on authoritarian propaganda. So Russia, all sorts of violent extremist movements across the world, and now about the Nazis. I wrote a history book, and now I'm working on my fourth one. But my background is deeply rooted in sort of the history and presence of Eastern Europe. My parents are from Soviet Ukraine. They were dissidents. The father was arrested by the KGB in 1978 and exiled. I grew up in London. Well, my dad worked for the BBC World Service and then Radio Free Europe. So very much born, I suppose I'm second generation at least, born into the middle of the great propaganda wars between dictatorships and democracies. And part of my books are about that historical context and what's changed. After university, I lived in Russia for 10 years. I worked for part of that time. I worked in the burgeoning Russian entertainment industry, or working for a production company that made entertainment shows for Russia, kind of a Western one. There were many Western companies there at the time, making the Russian version of, I don't know, The Apprentice or Come Dine With Me and all these wonderful products of Western culture. But it gave me a kind of a ringside seat to watch the emerging propaganda model of Putinism, which I wrote my first book about. That was called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which tried to capture kind of this new strain of propaganda, which is less about convincing with some grand ideology, but more about kind of destroying the concept of truth, really embedded in cynicism, which paves the way for unbridled aggression and a kind of very, very toxic tribalism. So I wrote about that. My first book was what, over a decade ago now. And I've literally just written the afterword for, I think, what, the third edition or something. And you know, the book has become a kind of depressingly relevant over and over again because what I saw in Russia has multiplied. I think Putinism caught a certain zeitgeist. And the afterword I wrote to the latest edition of the book was all about how it continues to be relevant for today's America. I mean, it's so interesting. Right now in America, there's sort of, just to give a small example, there's this sort of focus on how the latest violent extremism movements are really nihilistic rather than sort of left or right. And that so echoes what I saw in Russia already over 10 years ago. And look, there's obvious relevances to what's going on in Washington as well and across the world. But it's so interesting. I was sort of describing this kind of nihilistic violence that I saw in Russia as really a product of the end of history in many ways in the first decade of the 20th century, and now the same phenomena are prevalent here. So yeah, in some really kind of weird, warped way, Russia, by losing the Cold War, became a prophet of the future because now we're all losers. The politics of resentment is everywhere, and I suppose Russia managed to, or Putin has managed to, create a propaganda model based purely on believing in nothing, cynicism, anger, and resentment, because they were resentful before anybody else was resentful, but now everybody is.
Thank you so much for that intro. That was very, very refreshing for me and reminding me of why I find such value in your books. I have read Nothing is True multiple times, and my friend Marcy Shore is the one who reminded me to go back and mine it again, and I just did. And then also, this is not propaganda, also so incredibly amazing. And again, the nihilism, the cynicism is also relevant to what we are currently enduring. And you talk about the KGB, in my opinion, what we are seeing and what we've seen recently in the Oval Office is that they didn't lose the Cold War. I believe that whatever this is, Russia is winning it, and we're not even fighting back. And right now, if you're on Twitter, I don't know if you still go into that cesspool anymore. Our minds are continually being hacked. We continually see reports that come out later that Russian trolls or foreign influence operations are part of, pushing the narrative in a direction that's very undemocratic. And we brought you here today because we need your help in how we figure out how to claw our way back to truth. We have talked about, we need some sort of like what's left of the democratic world needs some sort of tech treaty, needs something to try to battle disinformation because in America we begged for it and it didn't happen. And now basically we have Russian propaganda all day long coming out of the current administration.
Yeah. Oh, it's a really interesting question. I mean, and I suppose a sense of like who is the we is the first question because um, I mean, we'll see where the United States lands, but the choice now is it between it kind of being neutral in some of the competition, let's just say Russia against Russia, or actually being um, a kind of I wouldn't call it an ally, but definitely aligned. And there is a great fear, which is based in some sort of evidence that America will turn from democracy promotion to autocracy promotion, that America, it's already happening, will use a combination of its tech power and its political weight and its economic power to to boost far right parties in Europe and Latin America, and that it will sees them as its civilization allies. Now, I don't think that's necessary. I think what we'll see is many things happening at the same time. I think America is going through a sort of personality breakdown where into different bits of America, and that is now reflected in its foreign policy. There's like three or four foreign policies happening at the same time, depending on who controls a bit of it, which is the sign of and that's what happens to empires when they fall apart. They stop being coherent. But um, so we might see multiple Americas. We might see a bit of America still doing its old thing of fighting dictatorships together with Europe, and then another bit of the system will be undermining liberal democracy and boosting very different movements. So the we is very problematic right now.
Yeah,
The mechanisms that used to be
yeah.
part of this are falling apart in America, or there's a kind of a civil war within the bureaucracy. So it's very hard what we mean by the we. Inside Europe, we're probably going to see right-wing Russian aligned parties possibly in power within the next 3 or 4 years in all the major countries. So I don't quite know what you mean by we.
Well, for me,
there is
the
no kind of
we
like
is
coherent we anymore.
no, that was incredible to think about all the divisions. For me, the we is the pro-democracy contingency, those who still would like to see democracies, imperfect as they are, continue. And I think that we've seen quite a recession in democracies recently. And I am, of course, very afraid for Europe. And we saw what the UK looked like, in the last few hours. And so, I grew up thinking that democracy was going to go on forever. And in my lifetime, I'm not seeing that. And I'm very, very afraid. And one of the things I learned from you is it really wasn't the job of journalists to have to fight information warfare. There should have been a robust, response department set up that could actually go after this stuff. And instead, it was like hands were just thrown up, or it was minimized to just being trolling. And as we know from your work and the work of, many people in this field, that's not the case. We have been being carpet bombed with disinformation. If you just look what happened this week with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, immediately the lies around it just ramped up, and also the mythologizing around it ramped up. And I wrote a piece about how it reminded me of what happened in Nazi Germany when Horst Wessel, a Nazi, a stormtrooper, died, and how Goebbels used that to create a martyr. And within minutes, somebody like Elon Musk is using the same words, fight or die. That's exactly the words that they used in Nazi Germany in 1930, fight or die, around Horst Wessel. And we keep seeing this stuff over and over again. And I'm, as a pro democracy person who is allied with pro democracy people around the world, I would like to reprioritize truth. And again, I don't exactly know how to do that when lies are so well funded and so well coordinated.
Mm. Yeah, I can't speak to the Kirk assassination. I think it's, incredibly tragic for a society when political violence is used as a recourse. And I would be cautious about any comparisons with Germany in the 1930s, frankly. But um, so so yeah, I'd be careful with those sort of parallels. But what's I mean, the question is complicated because um, well, firstly, the problem isn't lies. I think that's a misdiagnosis of the issue. Lies are part of democracy. Disinformation is part of democracy. We don't frankly care very much when the lies are on our side, let's be honest. So I don't think lies are the issue. Lies are part of the fabric of life. So I think what we're really talking about is the construction of identities, political identities, which dehumanize the other, which the rise of a type of discourse that makes the collaborative conversation that you need for democracy impossible. And then because it becomes impossible, you start to look for authoritarian solutions. So it's a system of propaganda that leads to basically you saying, well, democracy doesn't work. We need a cult-like leader. So I think that's the problem. I think we've actually missed. I understand why there was a tendency to diagnose this as around disinformation and about lies, but I think that's a very deep misdiagnosis and was really not very helpful because it led to the solutions being around things like fact checking and those sort of issues which are noble, very noble things, but are kind of missing the wood for the trees. And what we're dealing with, whether it is sort of historically or now, is the construction of identities and stories that lead to the destruction of democracy and ultimately terrorism, war, and violence. And I think that's the issue. And as long as we're talking about this in terms of lies versus truth, I think we've misdiagnosed the situation. The most effective extremist propaganda doesn't even need to use lies. It creates feelings, and you can do that by taking bits of evidence that are real. So I'd be very careful about making this about lies versus truth. Um,
Wow.
so I think that was a big mistake to think this was about the disinformation is the problem. It's sort of more a symptom as much as a cause. And the fact that people don't care about the truth. Now, that is a very interesting thing, that they don't seem to, there's no market for it. That I think is very, very important. And we need to think about why that is. How do we create
Wow.
contexts where we can agree on what facts are? That's very important for democracy, for us to be able to say, like a court of law, we admit this as evidence in our debate. That is very important. That's broken down, where a conspiracy theory can be as important as a piece of scientific evidence. The fact that that consensus is broken down starts to make democratic debate impossible because we can't agree on what constitutes evidence in a debate. So that's very important. And also there's sort of like, the fact that when politicians are caught out lying, no one seems to care. The fact that shame has disappeared. I think that's again a very important symptom. I don't think it's a cause. I think it's a very important symptom of a certain type of society that doesn't want to confront reality, yeah, where reality has no value and where almost purposefully giving the middle finger to reality is deemed a virtue. No, again, I think these things are symptoms, not causes. So I think that's the issues that we need to look at, and that I think
Wow.
takes you away straight away from like countering disinformation as the main mission. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. Don't get me wrong. I think fact checkers are actually often people who work at great risk in some societies. Fact checking in Brazil can lead you having physical threats aimed at you. I
Wow.
often think of fact checkers as sort of like, monks during the kind of like dark ages, like keeping together the sort of the grail of faith in some sort of objective truth. But that's not it's a symptom, I think, rather than a cause. And I don't think the solution is in that space either. But I think the I think the great I think what you're pointing to is something else, which is how in the First World War, in the Second World War, and the Cold War, America and its allies were able to create vast institutions that would prioritize fighting Nazi propaganda and then Soviet propaganda. But these were very much part of a larger strategy. They came together with a political decision. We're fighting these guys. An economic decision. We're going to struggle with them economically, and also an informational one. And you had the creation of bureaucracies, the political warfare executive in Britain in World War II, which is what my last book is about, and and the U.S. Information Agency in the Cold War that were part of this kind of like top, no, full spectrum push to compete in what they would have called political warfare, which is the war of ideas, the war of morale, confidence, all these intangibles, all these non-kinetic bits, and it was treated as warfare. Yeah. Often it was considered that using truth was an advantage because the idea was they lie, we tell the truth. It was part of the narrative that we told, but um, what was more important was that people thought that was something that would make you look good. Now that seems to have disappeared. So I think that's what's completely disappeared. Any kind of like, organization at that sort of level. But sadly, that's clearly not going to come from America anymore. If anything, the risk is that America is going to push for the opposite. So we can speculate all we want, but the reality is what we're likely going to see is a sort of a tie-in between the Stephen Millers and the Musks, who will be, using tech and who people fear, again, this is, we still see the full reality, but who people fear will use the power of American tech plus the power of American diplomatic and economic support to further their agendas, which will definitely not have much to do with supporting liberal democracy. So, so America's kind of left the field and is potentially now a negative player. The EU does not have any kind of capacity to think about this. It's just not organized this way. It would need a complete revolution in the way the EU thinks and acts for it to do something. The EU at the end of the day is about aligning laws and regulations. There's something they may do in the regulatory
Mm.
space, but frankly, the way they're approaching that at the moment is deeply self-destructive, and they're allowing themselves to be framed as if they're destroying freedom of speech in Europe.
Yeah.
And there are as many stupidities about the way that Europe is trying to regulate tech, but the sad thing is they're not communicating the way they want to do policy around communication. So that looks as if it's heading towards a disaster, frankly. And then you have individual countries, and there's frankly very little they can do. they're not really graduating to seeing this as a threat in any kind of coherent way. Britain is taking away its funding for this space. All I'm trying to get at is I don't think there's any chance really for on the horizon right now for any type of response like we saw in the Second World War or the Cold War. The West coming together. Well, there is no West anymore, but like,
Yeah.
America's allies coming together in any kind of coherent policy making or institutional thing. So what we're left with is a kind of, partisans of the public sphere, which is probably what we have to go for. Really thinking, that means thinking completely differently. That means thinking about what are the vulnerabilities in the authoritarian political warfare network. And I wouldn't just think about media content. I would think about cyber attacks, media, corruption, the whole way they try to spread influence, analyze that as a system, and start to essentially do this kind of partisan political warfare that looks to subvert it. So where can we attack its money source? Where can we attack
Yeah.
its various covert networks? Where are they doing something blatantly illegal so you can use law enforcement? And in terms of the information piece, how can we select the audiences that really, really, really matter and do very targeted strategic communications towards them? So I think what we might need is to create, again, frankly, I think this is beyond anything that anyone can do, but what would be the most realistic thing that I could see happening would be the vestiges of democratic forces, which would be a certain number of countries, a couple of companies, maybe some brave philanthropists, but I have very little faith in them, coming together to create a kind of, think about it, not the, like the special operations executive in World War II, which essentially did types of subversion in Nazi Germany. But not with kinetic things. I mean, I'm not saying we should blow anything up, but something like that. So let's say a really big issue that I'm fascinated in is the Singham networks. I don't know if you know him. He's a American billionaire, lives in China, works hand in glove with the Chinese state to create lots of campaigns across the world to um, basically attacking the Uyghurs, attacking Ukraine, attacking America, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so he has some sort of information assets. He has some sort of various kind of like NGOs that he uses. Like, how could one start to think about tackling this network? So I think something like that. You'd go sort of issue by issue and think about which are the really important ones, and which are the ones that we can try to do something about. Um, so I think that's probably the way to go, a kind of like retreat into kind of like this partisans of the public sphere. But overall, and I mean that's probably the best that we can hope for right now. If we're talking about kind of international collaboration, within each country individually, we can think about different solutions. But but things are pretty bad. I mean, I think we're into a sort of mitigation strategy now. And you know, that's just where we are.
Thank you so much for that. Hi-Fi, you jump in.
So, when I was introduced to your work, the title of the first book I've heard of from you really stuck out to me because that is a phrase that I have known since the late 80s, early 90s. Nothing is true, everything is possible. And for those in our audience who don't know, that is actually a supposed quote attributed to a man named Hassan-e Sabah, who was a Muslim cult leader who basically started political assassinations in the Muslim world back in the day. Why did you choose that title out of all the things you could have gone with? Why that?
Oh, I had no idea about the Assassin's Creed bit piece. No, it was kind of like it was a play on Dostoevsky, but also just seemed to sort of describe in 6 words what I saw in Russia. Then it turned out I wasn't aware at the time that Hannah Arendt had something very similar about Nazi Germany. So Yeah, so it hit all these, but I wasn't thinking about either of those when I put it together. If anything, I was thinking of more of Dostoevsky, like God is dead and everything is true, or something like that.
Okay,
But I no, I'm just trying to sum up what I've seen in Russia. But that's always a good sign when you're looking for something and then you've hit a furrow that others have been burrowing around.
well, so that's interesting to me because the book where I was introduced to that was a book by a man named Robert Anton Wilson, and it was called The
Oh, right, yeah,
Illuminatus
yeah, yeah. I
Trilogy.
read that as a
Yeah,
kid.
yeah.
Oh, so maybe because I read that as a kid, so maybe I got it from there. But it's always, maybe got stored in my head somewhere from
So
my 16-year-old reading.
the cool thing about that book was that book taught me that basically, while everyone agrees that there is this thing called reality and that it is based on truth and it is based on fact, it's actually malleable. And if you can get people to believe different truths and different facts, you can change the way they think. And this taught me about, I guess you'd call it narrative warfare, cognitive warfare, right? Psychological warfare, how to change people's minds. Do you see uh, a continuation kind of that if you can alter a people's thinking, you can alter the world kind of strategy in what Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, etc., are doing to the rest of the world today?
Um, yeah, I mean, totally. Firstly, the Russians have always put a very high premium on the cognitive sphere. They have all sorts of like fun ideas like the noosphere and the some of the Silicon Valley people play around with as well. Um, so yeah, no, they've always put a high premium there. They have a bunch of doctrine around this, saying pretty much that you can secure huge victories just by changing obviously the personal imagination, but actually like what we might call the collective imagination. Things we don't really like any of these ideas. I mean, in the more positivist West, we're very kind of like we find this all a bit all a bit unscientific. And while the Russians embrace a lot of these ideas, but they've always ranked it very highly. I think it goes from a sort of communist tradition where the idea that you change consciousness in order to secure the communist future. So the propagandist is much more than a spin doctor. They're right at the top of the kind of the pyramid of the states. And while we only kind of take propaganda seriously when there's an official policy that we're at war with somebody, then it rolls out, then it starts happening. And what's very interesting looking at the US is the way it kind of like gathers its information capacities when there's a war and then lets them go again straight away. The Russians would never let it go. For them, it's a permanent part of high level activity. Whoever is in charge of propaganda is right at the top of the decision making tree. In America, that's very rare. I mean, the only head of the US Information Agency who had that influence was a guy called Charles Wick, who was head of the US Information Agency in the 80s. And that's partly because of his personal influence with Reagan, also because Reagan prioritized these issues. But generally, it'll be like the third undersecretary of public diplomacy, a person with no power, who is meant to be in charge of US foreign, whatever you want to call it, propaganda, comms. There'll be something in the military. I mean, there'll be little bits here and there, but the idea that there's like an information czar is quite alien to the Western system. Um, so it's a very, very different tradition. So whatever you think about all these curious, stroke cranky ideas that the Russians have, whether you think a collective imagination exists or anything like that, the bureaucratic reality and the policy reality is that they prioritize this and they empower people, and they would think it would be crazy not to. And also, they obviously in their propaganda they say we do as well, but as we know, our system doesn't really work that way.
Well,
So
when we tried to have an information czar with Nina Jankowicz,
Yeah.
the propagandists in our country freaked the hell out because they knew that she would have come for them, right?
yeah,
And
I don't know. I think there's a lot of confusion about that role, and I think that was probably the opposite. But where they were trying to create a very small bureaucratic thing in DHS. I don't think there
Yeah.
was any choice I don't think the White House was aware of the creation of this thing and was rather surprised by the whole affair. So no, certainly she was not going for the role of Charles Wick. I don't think that's a, I don't, if she was, then that's kind of a little bit different. But no, I think here the comedy, well, the comedy was horrific what happened to her.
Yeah.
But the whole point was this was quite a very niche role in the Department of Homeland Security while they were trying to make it look as if it was something big. I don't think anybody in the White House was even aware of this role being created. I mean, at the top of the tree, I don't think the president knew about this.
Right. Well, we certainly rely on our authors and historians to help guide us on what's going on because I don't think we've seen any, whether it was the Biden administration or the current administration, I don't see any again, I appreciate everything you said. I'm a girl who does not like this timeline that we're living in. And speaking of the
Neither do
book
I.
that hi-fi, I don't like it. I don't like it. I was raised by German immigrants. They made great Americans. They came out of a war, and like it. Came here, lived the American dream when it was still possible, and here we are again. But I want to just offer this quote and just a last line from you. This comes from Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. With no idea of the future left, facts become unnecessary. They are, after all, unpleasant things, reminders of one's mortality and limitations. The process occurred in Russia harder and faster because cynicism and disillusionment set in earlier. Everything turned into a dark carnival more rapidly. The Russian president turned politics into a reality show, remaking authoritarianism with the logic of 21st century entertainment. I bring that quote up because A, it's brilliant, and B, I feel like we are living under the tyranny of some sort of reality TV fascism, and I don't like it. I want to unplug it. I worked in entertainment, you worked in entertainment. I just feel like there's just got to be a way where we can make, facts sexy again. We have a person in control of health in America that's an anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorist. At some point, people get sick and they're going to be like, huh, maybe there was an alternative. How I just,
Well, yeah.
any final thoughts?
No, no, but listen, I think there's no how this would work at a kind of structural level is not hard to imagine at all. Um, and I think people in America are full of great ideas about how you would remake the tech sector, how would you remake media. Um, so America is full of great ideas about this, whether it's creating social media platforms that further collaborative debate, which are ironically developed in the US, but actually implemented elsewhere, like in Taiwan, because the US has no system of then taking these good ideas and growing it. It has no public sector, civil society doesn't seem to activate itself for these grand media projects. We know, there's lots of ideas how you would remake reality shows. Actually, you could start with entertainment. How do you create reality shows which foster collaborative behavior? Um, that foster a different sense of community. We all know how to do this. This is not there's plenty of examples around the world how you would change the American primary debates so they would actually get politicians to think together and show how they find solutions. We know how to do this. The problem in America is not that nobody doesn't know the technology of how to do this. The problem in America is that none of this brings instant profit, and everything else does. So I am by no means an anti-capitalist, but usually in societies you have some space for things that are good for society. Often that's done through the church, through all sorts of civic institutions that foster this common space where we can actually practice democracy. And America has chosen for reasons that I am not clever enough to analyze to destroy itself. And that's a choice. That's not because nobody knows how to do something else. They do. That's not because the talent is not here. It is. That's not because the history how to do this is not here. It is. This has been done before in America. And actually, I think if anything, there is going to be a regeneration. It might well be through religious institutions. But America has chosen to have nonstop cognitive civil war, but that's a choice that America has made, and it makes it every day. And I'm afraid it's made by MSNBC and CNN as well. You know, they didn't bother doing something different. They just do a very bad version of a very unsuccessful version of what the right does. But that's a choice America has made. Um, and one has to live with one's choices, I suppose. There's been many opportunities, and there will be many opportunities to do something else. So I really don't think this is about not knowing what to do. The solutions are all around us. They have been historically. But America's maybe this is because it's so successful, it can allow itself this. For maybe because it's such a successful country, it can experiment with this. As somebody from Eastern Europe, obviously I'm very worried because these this sort of playing about with constant dehumanizing of each other, this playing about with throwing facts out the window, this playing about with all these sort of authoritarian experiments are haven't historically ended very well. So it is very, very worrying. But I don't know, I do a lot of polling in America, and everybody says about how they yearn for the return of truth, how they yearn for overcoming division, how they yearn for D-Day and the moon landing and building the Hoover Dam and all these great things that Americans did together. And that tells me that there is actually a demand in America for that. So if somebody were to say, look, I'm creating a social media company that is based on finding collaborative solutions. Yeah. Instead of riling hate against each other. Or I'm going to create a massive TV channel that's going to be all about not bringing two sides together. That's pathetic. That's nonsense, bringing sides together. It's not about that. It's about like, how do we do something together? Yeah. So how do we actually get things done together? It's going to be all about that. Yeah. I'm going to develop, entertainment shows that cultivate how we get stuff done together. So if somebody were to do that, the polling suggests that actually there is a huge market for it. Yeah, there is a
Mm,
huge desire for it. But you have to do
right.
it. And these are big interventions. They don't work on the micro level. But historically, they've been done. I mean, obviously, you have that with the way Roosevelt decides to use radio in at the time of the Great Depression. But it's that sort of intervention that's needed. Someone's going to go, I am going to transform the communication space with a different type of communication. You have that with the creation of the BBC in Britain in the 20s. That's a conscious decision at a time of vast polarization, the influence um, of dictatorships to go, we are going to create a new type of communication that gets democracy functioning. Yeah. Um, those are big choices that need to be made by people who have the means to do that. I suppose what again, and the idea that we don't know how to is just a total myth. We do.
Yeah,
There's no
right.
desire to, because it,
Yeah,
it wouldn't make instant money. Very often
yeah,
these things come from a kind of a
yeah,
civic a civic consciousness. So that's the first thing. But I think what you're asking, Heidi, as well, is what can individuals do? What can we do? Because for that you do need a kind of high level intervention. What can individuals do? And I think there is actually a lot individuals can do. I'm just working on a new book about that right now. Um, so I do think there's things we can do at our level, but they are incremental, and they might not be as satisfying as that.
thank you so much. On a personal level, thank you so much for this brilliant interview. I'm very grateful you took time with us today. Just on a very personal level, you gave me a clue on how to talk to um, dyed in the wool, MAGA, Freedom Corner, J6, you people who were standing out in front of the prison in DC or in front of the jail in DC for a long time by saying the things that they believe in is American excellence. And if they knew something was actually hurting that, and I managed to find a way in to speak with these
Interesting.
people. You said, what
Okay,
unites them?
what
You said,
happened? Tell me.
well, it was amazing. What two things. You said what unites them in this moment is their hatred of Joe Biden and their belief in American excellence. So I was able to, with that knowledge, talk to them about what I felt was happening to harm American excellence. The fact that we were aligning ourselves with an authoritarian countries and mindset, and that really actually gave them pause, and we were able to have a decent conversation about that. So for
Yeah.
me, finding out how to talk to people, not being blunt instruments and, butting heads, but figuring out an in was really, really vital. So I thank you. And I thank
Yeah.
you
So
so much for your work.
exactly. I think that's exactly the sort of. I mean, I'd be fascinated to know how that works. I mean, the only thing that I find works is just asking people how they came to their beliefs. Because the
Yeah.
moment you ask them that, it stops being trying to fight them on every point. But you're suddenly talking to a human. Um, and you might not like that human, by the way. You might deeply disagree with them, but at least you're talking to a person, not a bunch of slogans. And people
Yeah.
often ask me actually, like, how do I talk to my relatives who are, maybe in a conspiracy bubble or this kind of soft conspiracy political bubble that people are in, where they're like, I'm against January 6th, but they had a point, that sort of, which is where a lot of people on that side of the political spectrum are. I mean, it's quite rare to read. I mean, full Jan 6s are quite rare, but sort of slightly sympathetic is scarily common. And Yeah, I just always ask them like, how did you end up here? Because I mean, and then you get a very personal story, often a story of personal trauma, a
Yeah.
story of some sort of event that pushed them away from trust. Because at the end of the day, it's always a story of how they stopped trusting the mainstream media, the fairs, the government, and so on. And sometimes you just find a racist, and then you're like, oh, you're just a racist. That's pretty easy then. But often you don't. Often you find something much more complicated. And all that does is humanize the conversation. It doesn't solve anything. And I'm not a huge believer in like coming together in a kumbaya moment. I really don't think democracy is about that. Democracies should be polarized and contested, but they do require us to be able to talk to each other and come to some sort of decisions together. And the first step is just talking to people as people and not as a set of slogans. And I find that's a victory already because I'm sure like the scary thing is when you start talking to slogans, trying to get through to somebody and they're like, everyone's ripping us off, or the deep state is coming to get us, or like they just talk in these cliches,
Yeah.
and that kills any kind of conversation. Or they talk in conspiracy theories, and that kills any conversation. So just getting to the point where you can have a conversation, getting to the point where you can actually disagree genuinely, not just clash cliches, but actually start to disagree substantively, is already a huge progress. And Actually, that is something we can all do. That is something where we're not helpless. Um, but I think that maybe that's so important, Heidi. It's so great that you tried something, because at the moment, I think, you know, the temptation right now is to give up. And what I see in America is the temptation that many people in the former Soviet Union had, which is what they call inner immigration, внутренняя иммиграция, is when things are so bad, you just hide away in your private life. And that's very, I feel that basically. I've actually went through a period of just not looking at the news for a month, which that's not helpful either. So, but the macro level is so depressing that I think just starting with those micro things might be a very important lesson. And I know that doesn't feel like a lot, but at the end of the day, cumulatively, um, it's very important, and finding that personal resilience is very, very important. And maybe it's a bit like what, Václav Havel, the great Polish dissident and the great Czech dissident and playwright, wrote about the need to live in truth, which is a very, very famous idea that he had in the Soviet Union, where everything was bathed in lies. And he meant something just about not being hypocritical, not supporting communism when you don't believe in it. And we're in a different world now. No one's actually forcing us to believe in MAGA or believe, you can retreat into your own bubble. But maybe right now, what living in truth means is actually not giving up and trying to still find democratic communication in a time when that's impossible. And again, I don't mean sort of like hugging a fascist, yeah, at all. What I do mean is trying kind of like in our everyday communication to find, you know, that elemental quotidian attempt at democratic discourse. I mean that's turned out to be the most important thing of democracy that we kind of never thought about because we think a lot about elections and courts
Yes.
and all these institutions, but it turns out the whole thing is held together with this completely um, very hard to kind of capture the completely essential democratic discourse, a way of speaking, a way of communicating that where facts play a role, where we can disagree, collaborate, come to decisions, move on. It's actually completely unique. And that is something we can help cultivate every day. At the end of the day, it does need a different type of media ecology, but it's something we can cultivate every day. And if you go back to the founding fathers, the American ones, they value this so much. They talk about how, that's what Congress is meant to do, is meant to refine the national conversation into a more kind of like political one that makes more sense. And it's meant to be almost this distillation process of, the instincts of the masses into like the more refined conversation in Congress and so on. They're obsessed with this idea of a type of discussion being the definition of democracy, which is incredibly difficult to do, but maybe we can all take steps towards it, and maybe that's what we have to start with right now. At the end of the day, there's a reason why um, it was so valued, and that's because it makes for incredibly successful societies when it works. We can get all these different people and attitudes talking together, stepping over their instincts sometimes, stepping over their prejudices, getting to something. The collective power of getting stuff done is awesome. And it's not, and when it goes wrong, it leads to civil wars. The stakes are pretty high.
Absolutely. I feel I feel great, Phil. I feel like there's been some sort of rehumanization element in that, as opposed to dehumanizing people, rehumanizing people. And that made me feel very, very good and even slightly optimistic, which I'm truly grateful for. Peter Pomerantsev, so grateful you were here with us today. Looking so forward to your next book project and high fidelity, final thought, final word.
I find it interesting that you use the phrase media ecology because when I look at the media that people are consuming, predominantly radio, television, internet, social media, um, all of those outlets have been captured, it feels like, and turned into a weapons delivery system in this cognitive warfare. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, totally. That's why it is such a tragic place at the moment. And that is a choice. And I've been in America 4 years. I spent a lot of my time going to Ukraine here for 4 years. And since I got here, there's been so much discussion of the problem. I mean, the diagnosis is very well refined, really good analysis of the choices that were made. I mean, this is the thing about America. It's got the best communication scholars. Have a look at the work of, I don't know, Kathleen Hall Jameson at University of Pennsylvania, who's been writing for what, 30 years about the right-wing echo chamber. I mean, the 90s, she nailed it in the 90s. She's like, whoa, we have a very dangerous thing happening here where society will stop talking to itself. Yeah. She said that in the 90s. She completely read where this is going in the 90s. Now we have these beautiful analysts of where social media has gone wrong. I mean, there's this guy at Harvard whose name has completely left my head. I've forgotten about that's so embarrassing. But there's people like Talia Stroud or Eli Pariser, these wonderfully sort of sophisticated analysts of where the online ecology went wrong, how it sort of transformed from the world of blogs and interactions in the early 2000s to these kind of monstrous feeds, kind of like activating the very worst in us. So there's this beautiful analysis of everything that's going wrong, and a lot of brilliant projection about how it could be put right. Yeah, America is still the best at, I don't know, producing micro experiments of designing a different type of social media that would be beneficial to democratic discourse. I mean, even Google has come up with something called the Habermas machine, an AI that would help solve disagreements in society. So this is the paradox of America. All the best analysts are here. All the best innovation is here. Nobody wants to scale it because it will not help you win an election tomorrow, and it won't help you sell chewing gum or hate tomorrow. Yeah. And so at some point, something has to break through. Someone has got to step forward and say, no, I'm creating something else for the good of society. And it's just very unclear in America for me who that's going to be. But it's not, I sometimes hear people say how. I'm like, how? America is full of great ideas about how. It's more like who and with what money is the question here, because there's no tradition of public service media, and what's left of it is being destroyed. So it can't be the European way. In Europe, we actually have an immune system for this. In Northern Europe, especially, Northeastern Europe, especially, Northwestern Europe, especially, we have a tradition of public service media that can intervene to balance out the psychology. Yeah, it's not doing it perfectly, but it's still incomparable to what you have in America. Whether it's the BBC or the Swedish public broadcaster, their job is to intervene in this sort of moment to, smooth out the echo chambers, to make sure there is still a kind of a space, I don't know, a church green that creates the space. In America, I expect actually, paradoxically, the most hopeful places I see, and I know this sounds bizarre, but there's some sociology that backs it, the mega churches. Weirdly, mega churches, because they're so big, yeah, are actually very mixed. Yeah, unlike the small evangelical churches, which tend to be Christian nationalists now, the mega churches, and there's very interesting work by my colleague Harkri Kran about one in Cincinnati, is actually somewhere that brings different people together. Yeah. So look, in America, it's going to be a much more complicated mix of factors: sports clubs, businesses, churches that have the potential to step forward and be these spaces where democracy is constituted and practiced, where it's practiced. And of course, we definitely need a new type of social media that would cultivate that as well. Without that, it's going to be very, very hard today. There's a lot of faith put into local media. I'm doubtful. I just think that newspapers are, with all the best will in the world, the wrong medium, the wrong vessel. And they can't play the role they played in the early 20th century again.
Yeah.
But one can be hopeful that all the talent is in America, all the potential is in America. We just need someone to put it into practice.
Thank you so very much for that, Peter Pomerantsev. We're so grateful.
Thank
Grateful
you.
for your
Thank you.
insights.
All
Thank you.
right.
That was
Bye.
amazing. Thank you.
Bye-bye.